January 17th, 1945. Iwo Jima, volcanic ash rising in the pre-dawn stillness. The air tasted of sulfur and salt. Lieutenant Colonel Takechi Nishi stood at the edge of an observation post carved into Mount Suribachi's northern slope, his binoculars trained on the dark Pacific horizon. The volcanic rock beneath his boots still radiated warmth from the island's restless core. In the distance, the first gray light revealed what he had been dreading for weeks. A fleet so vast it seemed to merge sea and sky into a single armored entity. 400 warships, 70,000 men. The largest amphibious assault in Pacific War history was aimed directly at this 8-square-mile island of black sand and death. Nishi lowered his binoculars, slowly. An Olympic equestrian champion, a man who had dined with Hollywood stars and shaken hands with American generals in Los Angeles before the war. He understood something his fellow officers refused to acknowledge. The men approaching this shore were not the soft, materialistic degenerates Tokyo propaganda had promised. They were something else entirely, something the Empire of Japan had catastrophically underestimated. The bombardment began at dawn. 16-inch shells from battleships offshore struck with such force that volcanic sand transformed into glass. The sound was not merely loud, it was geological, as if the earth itself was being torn apart at its seams. For 72 days, American forces had pounded Iwo Jima from sea and air. Now, as landing craft churned toward the beaches, Japanese defenders crouched in their underground fortresses and waited. They had been told that American soldiers were undisciplined, that they relied on machines because they lacked warrior spirit, that they would break when confronted with true Bushido resolve. They were about to discover how wrong Tokyo had been. The Marines who stormed ashore on February 19, 1945, encountered a landscape designed for slaughter. The beaches weren't beaches at all. They were slopes of volcanic ash so loose that men sank to their ankles with every step. Tracked vehicles bogged down within yards of the waterline. Artillery pre-registered on every inch of exposed ground opened up the moment the first wave committed. Within minutes, the shoreline became a killing zone where wounded men drowned in black sand, where the volcanic grit infiltrated wounds and machinery with equal indifference. But they kept coming. From his position deep inside the island's defensive network, Major Yoshitaka Hori watched through a periscope with growing disbelief. He had expected confusion, retreat, the collapse of morale that inevitably followed heavy casualties. Instead, he witnessed something that contradicted everything his military education had taught him. American Marines, pinned down by interlocking fields of fire, didn't withdraw. They organized. Under direct fire, small unit leaders established rallying points. Sergeants and corporals, non-commissioned officers who in the Imperial Army would never have been trusted with independent decisions, began coordinating flanking maneuvers without waiting for orders from above. "They fight like officers," Hori muttered to his aide, a young lieutenant who had never seen combat before Iwo Jima. "Every one of them fights like he commands the battle himself." This was the first shock, the initial crack in the ideological armor Japanese officers wore. The American military didn't function according to the rigid hierarchies that defined Japanese warfare. It was decentralized, adaptive, empowered at the lowest levels. When a lieutenant died, a sergeant assumed command. When the sergeant fell, a corporal took over. The chain of command didn't break. It simply reformed around whoever remained capable of leading. This wasn't the weakness of a soft democracy. It was a different kind of strength entirely. One built on trust rather than obedience, on initiative rather than compliance. The volcanic terrain of Iwo Jima favored defense in ways few places on Earth could match. The island's geography was a fortress architect's masterpiece, ridges, ravines, caves, and tunnels where defenders could retreat, reposition, and emerge behind advancing troops. Japanese engineers had spent months creating a subterranean maze of interconnected positions. 11 miles of tunnels linking 1,500 fortified caves. Colonel Tadamichi Kuribayashi, the island's commanding general, had studied American tactics extensively. He abandoned the traditional banzai charge doctrine, forbidding suicidal frontal assaults in favor of systematic, prolonged resistance. Every position was designed to require overwhelming force to neutralize. Every cave had multiple exits. Every strong point supported its neighbors with overlapping fire. Against this defensive masterwork, the Americans brought not just firepower, but an unsettling combination of courage and calculation. Captain Tsunezo Wachi, commanding a reinforced company in the island's central highlands, recorded his observations in a diary later recovered from his body. His entries from the battle's first week reveal a man watching his certainties disintegrate. February 21st. The Americans advance with flamethrower teams supported by riflemen who provide covering fire with a discipline I did not expect. They move deliberately, without the rashness propaganda attributed to them. When we destroy one tank, 2 more arrive within the hour. They do not seem to fear death, yet they do not seek it foolishly. This is not what we were told about democratic soldiers. February 23rd. Mount Suribachi has fallen. I watched through my field glasses as their flag rose on the summit. My men were silent. The Americans who climbed that mountain did so under fire from 3 directions, across terrain we believed impassable under combat conditions. They carried that flag to the top as if its placement mattered more than their own survival. I begin to understand that we are fighting men who believe in something beyond the Emperor's command. They believe they are liberating the world. This belief makes them formidable in ways our training never addressed. The flag raising on Suribachi, immortalized in Joe Rosenthal's photograph, was more than a symbolic moment. To the Japanese officers who witnessed it, the image crystallized a disturbing realization. These were not conquered people fighting for colonial masters, not mercenaries motivated by pay. These were true believers in their cause, convinced with religious fervor that their way of life represented humanity's best hope. The irony was not lost on the more thoughtful Japanese commanders. They had gone to war believing themselves the liberators of Asia from Western imperialism. Yet here were Western soldiers who seemed equally convinced of their moral righteousness. Lieutenant Colonel Nishi, the Olympic champion who had befriended American officers during the 1932 Los Angeles Games, understood this paradox better than most. In the tunnels beneath Iwo Jima, he spoke candidly with his men about what they faced. Baron Nishi had lived in the United States, had experienced American culture beyond propaganda caricatures. He knew that the Marines clawing their way across the island weren't soft or decadent. They were the products of a society that valued individual worth, that encouraged questioning authority, that built strength through diversity rather than conformity. They are not like us, he told his officers during a briefing on the battle's 5th day, and that is precisely what makes them so dangerous. We were trained to obey without question, to sacrifice ourselves on command. They were trained to think, to adapt, to solve problems independently. When we kill their leader, another emerges immediately. They do not collapse into confusion. They are like the mythical Hydra. Cut off one head, and 2 more appear. This is the strength of their democracy, and we have no counter to it. The battle's rhythm became a grinding atrocity that consumed both sides. Marines armed with flamethrowers and satchel charges reduced Japanese positions 1 cave at a time. Defenders emerged from hidden spider holes to attack from behind, then vanished back into the volcanic rock. Casualties mounted with mechanical inevitability. The Americans lost 7,000 killed and 19,000 wounded. The Japanese lost 21,000, virtually their entire garrison. But it was in the manner of fighting that Japanese officers found their assumptions shattered most completely. Major Hori documented the Americans' use of combined arms with something approaching professional awe. Naval gunfire, aerial bombardment, artillery, tanks, infantry, engineers, and flamethrower teams operated in seamless coordination. When defenders concentrated fire on one advancing element, supporting units adjusted instantly to exploit the exposure. The Americans seemed to have unlimited resources, but more disturbing was their unlimited creativity in applying those resources. They adapted to every tactic, countered every defensive innovation, solved every problem the terrain and Japanese engineers had created. In one sector, Marines encountered a cave complex that had repulsed 3 assaults. Artillery and naval shells couldn't penetrate deep enough to neutralize the defenders. Flamethrowers couldn't reach the inner chambers. On the fourth assault, American engineers sealed the secondary exits with explosives, then used pumps to force seawater into the main entrance, systematically flooding the tunnels. When survivors emerged gasping for air, they surrendered to an enemy who had just demonstrated technological problem-solving on a scale they had never imagined possible. Captain Wachi, observing from an adjacent position, wrote, "They turn the ocean itself into a weapon. There is no situation for which they do not have a solution, no obstacle they cannot overcome with either courage or ingenuity. We fight with spirit and doctrine. They fight with spirit and endless adaptation. I fear we cannot win against such an enemy, not because they are braver, many are clearly terrified, but because their system produces solutions faster than we can create problems." The symbolic object that appeared throughout Japanese diaries and post-war testimonies was neither a weapon nor a sound, but something far more psychologically devastating: the American ration. Specifically, the small cardboard boxes, cylinders, and packets that Marines carried into battle, each one containing more variety and nutrition than most Japanese soldiers received in a week. When Japanese troops overran American positions, rare occurrences that happened most often during night infiltrations, they found themselves confronted with an abundance that defied comprehension. Sea ration boxes contained not just food, but luxuries: cigarettes, candy, chewing gum, instant coffee, even toilet paper. Each item represented not merely superior logistics, but a fundamental philosophical difference in how the two nations valued their soldiers. Imperial Japanese forces operated on the assumption that suffering built character, that deprivation strengthened warrior spirit. Soldiers were expected to endure on minimal rations, to view hunger as a test of loyalty. Officers justified the lack of medical supplies, the inadequate food, the absence of rest and rotation as necessary hardships that separated true warriors from the weak. The Americans operated on precisely the opposite principle. Their military-industrial complex, the democracy's war machine that Japanese propaganda ridiculed as soft and materialistic, was actually predicated on the radical idea that soldiers were valuable, that their lives and comfort mattered, that keeping them fed and equipped and healthy made them more effective fighters rather than less. This was not weakness. It was a different calculus of human worth entirely. Lieutenant Toshihiko Ono, a company commander who survived the battle by retreating into the deepest tunnel complexes, recalled his first encounter with an American ration pack. His unit had ambushed a Marine supply party on the battle's 19th day, killing 3 men and capturing their equipment. Among the seized material were several cases of K rations. "We gathered around those boxes like children at New Year," Ono later testified. "Inside was more food than I had eaten in 3 days. Crackers, canned meat, dried fruit, chocolate bars, sugar tablets, cigarettes of remarkable quality. There was even a small can opener on a chain. But what disturbed me most was not the abundance. It was the care evident in the packaging. Someone in America had thought carefully about what a soldier would need, what would maintain not just his body, but his morale. Our rations were rice and pickled vegetables, handed out irregularly, sometimes moldy. Theirs were designed by people who seemed to value their soldiers' well-being. I realized then that we were not fighting an army. We were fighting an entire civilization that had mobilized not just its weapons, but its compassion. How do you defeat an enemy who believes his soldiers are worth feeding well? This was the second great shock, the revelation that Japanese officers found almost impossible to process. American abundance wasn't a sign of decadence. It was a weapon system in itself. Well-fed soldiers fought harder and longer. Soldiers who knew they were valued by their nation fought with confidence rather than desperation. The logistics that kept Marines supplied on Iwo Jima's bloody slopes represented the same industrial and organizational capacity that was producing ships, planes, and weapons at a rate Japan could never match. But beyond the material advantage was something more subtle and more devastating. The Americans seemed to genuinely care whether their soldiers lived or died. Japanese forces were trained to view death in combat as the highest honor, a goal rather than a risk. American forces treated death as a tragedy to be avoided through training, equipment, medicine, and overwhelming firepower. They brought the war's full industrial might to bear not to glorify combat, but to end it as quickly as possible with minimal friendly casualties. Navy corpsmen, medics who accompanied Marine units, became figures of almost supernatural reputation among Japanese observers. These men, wearing no armor and carrying minimal weapons, rushed into fire to treat wounded Marines. They administered morphine, applied bandages, called for stretcher bearers, and performed emergency surgery under conditions that violated every principle of military logic as the Japanese understood it. Why would a modern army dedicate trained personnel to saving lives in the middle of battle? Why not let the wounded die and replace them with fresh troops? The answer, that American democracy considered each individual life irreplaceable, was philosophically incomprehensible to officers raised in a system that treated soldiers as expendable components of the emperor's will. Major Hori watched through a periscope as a corpsman dragged a wounded Marine behind cover while under direct machine gun fire. The corpsman was hit twice before reaching safety but continued treating his patient even as his own blood soaked into the volcanic sand. Japanese soldiers in Hori's position, following their orders, killed both men with a grenade. But Hori himself was shaken. "We killed a man whose only weapon was mercy," he wrote. "He died trying to save one wounded American, and his death brought 3 more Marines charging at our position with such fury that we barely survived. They are individuals, but they fight for each other with a ferocity that exceeds our collective devotion to the Emperor. This is the contradiction we cannot resolve. Democratic individualism should make them weak and divided. Instead, it makes them stronger than our enforced unity. I do not understand how this is possible, yet I watch it happen every day." The transformation in Japanese officers' perception occurred gradually, through accumulation rather than revelation. Each engagement added evidence that contradicted years of indoctrination. The Americans didn't break under pressure. They became more determined. They didn't abandon their wounded. They risked additional casualties to retrieve them. They didn't defer to superior officers out of mere obedience. They collaborated in planning and execution as if rank conveyed responsibility rather than absolute authority. By the battle's 4th week, Japanese resistance had been compressed into the island's northern pocket, a jumbled landscape of rocks and ravines where defenders made their final stand. Colonel Kuribayashi, the garrison commander, sent his last message to Tokyo on March 16th. In it, he acknowledged what many of his surviving officers had already concluded. "Our enemy is not what we were told. They fight with discipline and courage that equals our own, supported by resources that exceed our capacity to counter. We have inflicted heavy casualties, but they replace losses faster than we can inflict them. The battle is decided not by our failure of will, but by their superiority in every material category and their unexpected superiority in small unit leadership. I humbly apologize for our inability to defend this island, but I assert that our soldiers have faced opponents far more formidable than propaganda prepared us to fight." Lieutenant Colonel Nishi was killed on March 22nd, leading a nighttime counterattack that briefly recaptured several positions before being driven back. His personal diary, recovered later, contained a final entry that circulated widely among Japanese officers after the war. In it, the Olympic champion who had lived in America, who had befriended American officers, who understood both cultures, wrote his epitaph for the battle and perhaps for the war itself. "I am about to die on this island, killed by men I might have called friends in different circumstances. I hold no hatred for them. They fight bravely for what they believe, as we fight for the Emperor. But I must record this truth, even if no one reads it. We were told that Americans were soft, that they loved comfort more than honor, that their democracy made them weak and divided. Every part of this was a lie. They love comfort, yes, but they also love each other and their ideals more than comfort. Their democracy doesn't divide them. It multiplies their strength by trusting each individual to act with courage and initiative. We built our army on obedience. They built theirs on trust. In a long war, trust defeats obedience because trust allows adaptation and obedience demands repetition. We are repeating tactics that failed in 1942. They are inventing new solutions every day. This is why they will win. Not because they have more ships and planes, though they do, but because their system produces better soldiers at every level of command. I die with honor, but I die knowing we were defeated before we began, not by their weapons, but by their philosophy. Democracy is not weak. It is the strongest force in the world when combined with industrial capacity and moral certainty. Tell Tokyo this truth, though I know they will not listen until it is far too late. The battle officially ended on March 26th, though isolated pockets of resistance continued for weeks. Of the 21,000 Japanese defenders, fewer than 300 were captured alive, most of them too wounded to resist or too unconscious to commit suicide. The Americans suffered 27,000 casualties, taking an island barely large enough to hold a small city. The strategic value, air bases for B-29 bombers targeting the Japanese mainland, was achieved. But the psychological impact on Japanese military thought was perhaps more significant than the tactical outcome. Post-war interviews with surviving Japanese officers revealed a consistent pattern. Almost universally, they expressed shock at American fighting effectiveness, respect for American small unit leadership, and a belated understanding that the war had been unwinnable from its inception. Not because Japan lacked courage, Iwo Jima proved Japanese soldiers could fight with suicidal determination, but because the United States combined material abundance with a military philosophy that empowered individuals rather than crushing them into obedient components. Major Hori survived the battle and later became one of its principal Japanese historians. In his memoirs published in 1965, he reflected on what Iwo Jima revealed. We believed that our spiritual strength would overcome American material advantage. We were half right. Spirit matters greatly in war, but we failed to understand that the Americans possess spirit equal to our own, combined with material advantages we could never match, and a command system that made them far more adaptable than we were. The Americans who fought on Iwo Jima were not the pleasure-seeking weaklings of our propaganda. They were professional soldiers from a nation that valued both individual life and collective purpose, that could be simultaneously democratic and disciplined, diverse and united. We had no answer to this combination. Iwo Jima taught us that democracy was not America's weakness, but its greatest strength. We learned this lesson at the cost of 21,000 lives, and still Tokyo refused to believe it. The recurring image in Japanese accounts, those ration boxes, those small cardboard packages, became a symbol more powerful than any weapon. They represented a nation that could wage total war while still treating its soldiers as human beings worth feeding well, worth keeping alive, worth bringing home if possible. The contrast with Japanese practice, where soldiers were expected to starve before complaining, to die before surrendering, to value the emperor's glory above their own survival, could not have been starker. This was not a difference in courage. Japanese soldiers on Iwo Jima fought with desperate bravery that commanded American respect. It was a difference in systems, in values, in the fundamental question of what human life was worth. The Americans treated their soldiers as valuable resources to be preserved. The Japanese treated their soldiers as expendable tools to be used until broken. In a war of attrition, the nation that valued its people inevitably defeated the nation that spent them carelessly. The epilogue to Iwo Jima played out in the war's final months. American forces continued their island-hopping campaign toward the Japanese home islands. Each battle followed similar patterns: fanatic Japanese resistance, heavy casualties on both sides, ultimate American victory through overwhelming material superiority and tactical adaptation. But among Japanese officers, a quiet despair settled in. They had seen the future on Iwo Jima's volcanic slopes. They knew how the story would end. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, when the emperor's voice crackled over the radio announcing surrender, those who had survived Iwo Jima felt something close to relief. Not because they welcomed defeat, but because they had known since that black sand beach that defeat was inevitable. The only question had been how many more would die before Tokyo acknowledged what frontline officers had learned months earlier. They were fighting an enemy superior not just in material terms, but in military philosophy, an enemy that had somehow combined democratic individualism with disciplined collective action in ways Japanese military theory claimed was impossible. Lieutenant Colonel Nishi's final diary entry, his assertion that democracy was the strongest force in the world when combined with industrial capacity and moral certainty, became a kind of unofficial epitaph for the Pacific War among thoughtful Japanese officers. It explained what had happened better than any tactical analysis. The war was lost not on any particular battlefield, but in the philosophical assumptions that prevented Japanese leadership from understanding their enemy. Americans fought well, not despite their democracy, but because of it. Their system produced soldiers who could think independently, adapt to chaos, trust their judgment, and work together without rigid hierarchical control. It produced an economy that valued human life enough to feed soldiers well, treat their wounds, and bring them home when possible. It produced a society convinced that its cause was just, that it was fighting for freedom rather than conquest, and that its sacrifices had meaning beyond abstract glory. The Japanese system produced brave soldiers, brilliant tactics, and impressive weapons. But it could not produce the adaptability, the trust, the individual initiative, or the sustainable motivation that characterized American forces. Iwo Jima revealed this gap more starkly than any other Pacific battle. On that volcanic island, Japanese officers watched their certainties die along with their soldiers. They saw the face of democratic power and understood, too late, that they had been fighting not just a nation but an idea, and ideas, when backed by industrial might and genuine belief, were more powerful than any amount of Bushido spirit. The volcanic ash of Iwo Jima still blows across that island, covering the tunnels and caves where 21,000 Japanese soldiers died defending a cause already lost. The American cemetery on the island was later moved. The bodies returned home to families who valued them enough to bring them back. This single detail, the Americans recovered their dead, brought them home, gave them individual graves with individual names, was perhaps the most perfect symbol of the philosophical divide that decided the war. One side fought for the glory of the state, the other for the dignity of the individual. One side spent lives as currency, the other invested them as treasures. One side valued obedience, the other valued initiative. In the crucible of Iwo Jima, these philosophies met in direct combat, and the outcome was never really in doubt. What Japanese officers said when they saw American Marines fight through fire was not recorded in any single statement. It was recorded in diary entries written by candlelight in doomed tunnels, in post-war testimony given by survivors who had watched their worldview collapse, in the quiet acknowledgement that they had been lied to about their enemy's character and their own chances of victory. They said, in 1,000 different ways, that they had underestimated democratic power, that they had mistaken tolerance for weakness, that they had confused freedom with chaos. They learned, at the cost of everything they held dear, that a nation of free people fighting for a cause they believed in was the most formidable force on earth. And the volcanic sand of Iwo Jima, mixed with the blood of two nations' bravest men, became the ground where that truth was written in fire and steel and sacrifice, a lesson purchased at such terrible cost that those who learned it could never forget, even when they desperately wished they could.